Hey guys, it's Mark from Erickson Machine and Performance again. In this video, we're going to go through porting cases, also going to show you how to epoxy fill them and what exactly that's doing. I always have customers that call me and ask me, do I need my cases epoxy filled? What exactly does that do? So I'm going to go through that and basically show you how to do it. So on the 62T cases, to save weight, there's voids in the castings. So on a stock motor, it really doesn't matter. When you start to port them though, you start to have issues. So on here, this casting flaw, well, the casting void, when we go to finger port this, we're going to end up grinding through here, okay? So what we're doing is allowing the air, one, to go into the cylinder, and then two, to go into the transfer ports. So, but when you do that, you actually grind right into here. So what we end up doing is we fill this with epoxy, so that way there's not a big hole here, which could leak, so on and so forth. The other areas that the 62T cases have issues is when you finger port on the front, on the stator side, you'll actually break through here. So we also fill this area with epoxy, so that way when we port, you don't have an issue. So what I end up doing, I end up using a round burr, so like this, and go inside all the areas to actually put a lip which gives it a mechanical seal. So you have to remember the way these are, technically this epoxy could pop straight out, so by actually putting grooves and roughing up the entire inside surface before you pour the epoxy has an area to grip, so that way, if the motor overheats, stuff like that, it doesn't just pop straight out. As long as you take the steps necessary to do it properly, you're really not going to have that issue. The only time you'll have an issue with epoxy popping out is if you super overheat an engine. You could have an issue where the aluminum expands so much it just breaks the bond between the aluminum and the epoxy. But by that point it's gotten so hot, the color on the paint has melted off and that stuff. The motor's got to get 400 degrees, 300 degrees in that area to start having that issue. And at that point, so many other things have gone wrong, it's too late. The other thing people ask, so there's epoxy filling the cases, which if you're just porting, a 701 or a 760, you're not really going anything bigger than, let's say, 85 millimeter bore. You really only have to fill here, 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 and here. If you're going over an 85 millimeter bore, or you're going with an aftermarket cylinder that requires significantly removing area here to match the cylinder, a DASA cylinder, TPE, so on, so forth, then you end up filling everything. Me personally, if it's not that motor, there's no reason to waste all the epoxy back here, because it's not really doing anything for you. The only real reason you need it is when you're going, 88 to, 93 millimeter pistons. This ends up being paper thin, so you have no gasket sealing surface anymore. So by filling this and then machining this back flat, you end up using the epoxy as the gasket surface. So the one other thing that you'll hear people ask about is stuffing the cases. So what that is you're basically building epoxy ramps on the inside where the reeds are to stuff the reeds so you're making the reeds work more efficiently because there's less air to compress when the reed closes. It also helps with velocity because you're taking up, you know, the loosely packed air and keeping it more refined where you'll actually flow more with it that way. Not everybody does it. It's an added expense. The other thing with it is whoever's doing it has to know what reeds you're using. Because if you're using, you know, a standard style cage or a buoys and rad valve, the reed angle is different than if you're using like a V-Force V2 or V3 reed that uses double sets of reeds and the reeds are on a different angle. You can end up having an issue where they don't end up fitting, and it defeats the whole purpose of stuffing the cases. That will be on another video when I do a larger build for you guys. This one we're just going to be epoxy filling up top and finger porting it. So give me a second. I'm going to take out the grinder. I'm going to open these all up, clean it, and then I'll show you what we do to start epoxy filling it. Alrighty, so these are all ground. So as I said, I used a small round burr like this, went inside, put grooves in each of them. I then went back and cleaned it. You really want to make sure all the surfaces are prepped and nice and clean. The other thing, before you start pouring epoxy, put the case bolts all the way in, because if not, when you pour the epoxy in, the epoxy is going to come out the bottom. You're going to have a huge mess. Couple things I do a little bit different. One, I take aluminum welding rod. You want to actually clean it first. Clean it with alcohol because they're surprisingly dirty. And then I cut them into small sections like this. So as I pour the epoxy, I'll actually start putting these in. Kind of acts like rebar. Epoxy is, the more of it you use, the more that it will shrink. So by putting aluminum inside with it, one, it helps with shrinking, and two, it makes it more stable. Some builders do it, some don't. The other thing you have to be careful of, there's two methods that this is done. So I overfill, so I fill above the top, and then when I'm done, I machine it back flat so you have a perfect gasket surface. Not everybody that pours stuff has access to a machine shop. If you don't, you know, pour it even, because when it dries it's actually going to shrink, or pour it a smidge under. But personally, I find the best way to fill it a little bit more and then machine it flat. The last tip I have, I heat up. So for this section, I end up using JB Weld. So when I stuff the cases, stuff the reed areas, I use DevCon. You can use JB Weld for both. You can use DevCon for both. I find JB Weld flows better, especially when it's hot. So what I do is I will take either hot water or just a heat gun and heat up the tube of JB Weld so it's hot. And by doing that, you kind of make it like a liquid. I pay attention to how I'm doing it, but I mix a little bit of each so that way it mixes a little bit better, or at least that's what I find. So and then I always do it in like a single time use cup. The smaller the cup, the better. If it was any taller than this, I would actually cut it so you could shrink it. so that way it's easier to pour it. So, and then I, obviously mix it extremely well so it's all consistent. So, and then if you notice, with it being as hot as it is, you can see how liquidy it is. Don't know if that's really a word, but it makes pouring it much, much, much easier. Then the other thing you should have laying around, which of course I do not, is a razor blade to help you scrape off whatever excess you get on a surface you don't want. So let us start pouring. So the cleaner you can be when you do it, the easier it is at the end to not have all kinds of messes everywhere. But the first time you do this, it's most likely going to be a disaster. Alright, so now what I'll start doing is putting the little pieces in that I cut. And I also find by doing this, you'll see the more you do it, you'll end up getting air bubbles down where you're porting into the finger port. And by putting this in, I find you're kind of shaking those bubbles up, so you end up getting more of them out. Just remember, if you aren't going to machine it afterwards, don't have them sticking up over the surface, of course. If you are going to machine it afterwards, it really doesn't matter. So now how I just had that little spill, you can just go back and grab it with a razor blade. And then in all honesty, you're porting it anyway, so it's really not the end of the world anyway you cut it. Guys, welcome back. So the top of the case is dry. I've removed the bottom case bolts. Now I went through, I'll show a picture of grinding and roughing up this intersection. Once again, I put inner grooves to allow the epoxy to have a step, which gives it not only the standard bond, but it's mechanically locked in because it bellies out, so it can't just pop out. So that's all done. Now we're just going to mix up a little bit more, pour it in, let that harden, and we'll be ready to start porting. So this uses a lot less epoxy, JB Weld. Now, on certain aftermarket cylinders, you end up machining a good amount out. So this whole upper section, you need to fill basically from here all the way to here, because this gets machined completely out. There's no reason to put that much epoxy over there if you're not doing that. One, it's added weight, and two, if you go total loss, it can be a pain having epoxy everywhere with the wires running through the trigger plate. And if it's not necessary, why waste JB Weld or DevCon? So mix it up really good. Make sure it's a nice even color. Go. Now I just kind of shake it around to get all the little bubbles to make sure everything's filled in all the corners, which helps when you go to port it in the end that there's no air voids where you're looking to port. There we go. Alright, when this is all hardened, we'll start porting. Alright, so here we go. The epoxy's all dry. I then went through, mounted this in a milling machine, and milled this flat. I didn't remove any material. In some of the more advanced porting videos I'm going to do in the upcoming months, we're going to start talking about port timing, what ways to modify it, what it does, stuff like that. What a lot of people do is if you want to lower the port timing on a particular engine, you can actually mill the surface of the case because it's the easiest thing to mill to drop the ports, and that way you can end up with some lower port timing. The engine we're building at the moment has very good low port timing, so lowering it more really isn't a necessity. So if you see, we epoxy filled this area, so this is completely full. And same thing, these on the surface are full and milled perfectly flat. So now what we're going to end up doing is we're going to go on the porting bench and we're going to end up doing finger ports in the cases. One thing with finger porting, the size of the engine you're building depends on how aggressively you should port the cases. Going crazy, and if you see videos or pictures of, a DASA 1200 or some monster motor, you see almost all this is completely milled out. This is all opened up. That works really, really well when you have a monster motor that has a ton of airflow going through it. On a smaller 701 or a 760, going that aggressive is actually not going to help performance because you don't have any flow velocity. So, the inside, when this piston goes down, it compresses the mixture until the port's open. The more air inside that is unneeded is more air to compress, but it ends up being compressed less because air is compressible. It's not like a fluid. So finding the happy medium of enough air but still having a nice compression as the piston goes down is something that really helps these engines perform well. So we're going to do a finger port that comes over basically to the side, even with the inside of the reed area, straight up, and just round everything over. So we're going to go over to the porting bench now and get started. Alright, so here we go. I drew out on here to show everybody. So in the casting you can kind of see a little bit of a crease here. So we're going to go a little to the side of the crease, come up, and be, a little over 1/4 of an inch under the top edge. And then we're just basically going to take this point and bring it to the inside of here and do a nice finger port. And then we're going to round the inside here. So I use an aluminum burr, which is, what is this? A 6 fluted burr. They're extremely sharp. They work really well, but they bounce around a little. If you're new to porting, I'd recommend sticking with, a standard carbide burr, a single or double cut. It'll take a little bit longer, but it's not going to bounce around as much. So, and I just work my way in. So when I port cases, what I do is I will flip it around like this. There we go. Change hand pieces out. There we go. So now what I will do is I will come in this way and I will start trenching this out. So I will go in gently, come up, and work my way in until I'm even with here. When you're doing aluminum, aluminum likes to bond into your burrs. So there's Ease Cut. Also Eastwood sells a product, Grinder's Grease. It's actually really, really well. Either one's fine. So what you can do is just fire it up and get a little bit on. If not, when it's hot, you can just dip it in and it'll melt onto it, you know, after you start cutting. So let's get cracking. Alright, so now we've went on to a smaller flat burr. The one thing I will say with this, so this stand I have is a CC Specialties porting stand. The thing is awesome. Once you get one, you can't really live without one, I don't think. It works really well. You can kind of angle everything in any position and mount it quickly. Doing stuff like this where you have to come from all different angles to port it correctly, it really, really helps. So now we're starting to get somewhere. So we got the one side roughed in, so we have a nice straight shot from inside the reed area straight up. So this is going to go straight up into the cylinder. And then when it's compressed, and whatever's left in the reed area, when the reeds are closed, it's going to flow straight into the transfer ports that way. So let me continue going, be back in a minute. Alright, so now I've taken a 1/2 inch diameter burr, which is got a 1/4 inch shank, so something like this, and that's what I've roughed this out with. So as you can see here, this has now become a straight shot in from the reed area. So when we round this all over from the inside, same with the other. This is just roughed out. So now when we flip this around and look from over here, hold on one sec. you'll see the same thing. This has been opened completely up all the way to the inside wall to wrap to the inside. Also to wrap up and run up into the port, into the cylinder. Same thing with this side. Now as you can see, the unported side, there's that wall blocking it right here, which that's basically what we just removed in the finger port. So now I'm going to come back in with a smaller burr. I'm going to come back in with this and do fine detail work, and then we're going to texture it. So let me do that and we'll be right back. Alright, so here we go. This side's completely done. The only thing I didn't do is texture the bottom where the reeds are. There's a reason for that. I'm going to do another video showing you how to do an epoxy ramp to actually stuff the reed area. So that video is to come. But you can see the finger ports. They're basically the thickness of a finger. It's the way I do it for the 701s, where you can slide your finger in. So you can see opened up evenly on both sides, squared. I round the boost port as well. So this is rounded. This is rounded to come up and in. So the air is going to come in and up into the cylinder, or in and up into the transfer port, depending on what part of the stroke it is. So I'm going to post a couple pictures, but that gives you an idea what you're going to want to do to port a set of 62 T cases. Alright guys, as usual, thanks for watching. Have a good night.